What if the stories about huge people weren't just made up? There are many signs around the world that something or someone much bigger once walked the earth. For example, huge stone blocks that can't be lifted by a modern crane, and old skulls that don't fit normal human sizes. On every continent, there are stories about Nephilim, red-haired cave giants, and huge temple builders. And deep in the ground, there are tools, tracks, and ruins that seem too big for humans to understand. Are these stories from long ago exaggerations, or lost proof that giants really existed? Stay with us, because the answer might be in the ruins. The giant skeleton controversies, hoaxes versus genuine finds. There are a lot of crazy hoaxes and amazing secrets about giant skeletons that people argue about. The most famous one was the Cardiff giant, a 10-foot-tall plaster figure that was discovered in New York in 1869. It fooled a lot of people before it was found to be a fake made of wood to take advantage of people's interest in ancient giants. But not every story has been thrown out so quickly. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American newspapers reported multiple finds of unusually large skeletons, some measuring 8 to 12 feet in height, unearthed in burial mounds across the Midwest. The Smithsonian Institution was often mentioned in these reports, allegedly collecting and then losing the remains, which fueled modern conspiracy theories about intentional cover-ups. While mainstream archaeologists insist that most of these reports were either exaggerated or misidentified animal bones, some photographs and excavation logs remain puzzling, showing skeletons with unusually long femurs and massive skulls. Outside the United States, other alleged giant skeleton finds complicate the narrative. In the Valley of El Beqara, Egypt, French explorers in the 1800s reported a skeleton over 11 feet long. In India, British colonial officers claim to have found titanic human remains near the Narmada River. While no verified specimens exist today, such claims appear in old excavation journals, sparking debates about whether these were cases of gigantism in isolated populations, or something else entirely. Modern science has occasionally stepped into this debate, though not always to the satisfaction of giant hunters. Some of the largest confirmed human skeletons, like that of Robert Wadlow, the Alton giant, prove that extreme height is biologically possible, though extremely rare. Wadlow stood at 8 feet 11 inches, a result of pituitary gigantism. But when reports claim multiple skeletons measuring well over 10 feet, we have to ask, were ancient populations affected by some unknown genetic condition? Or are these exaggerated tales built on misidentified animal fossils and fraudulent displays? The giant of Castelnau, who was found in France in 1890, is an interesting case that is still being talked about. During a dig, 3 very large human bones were found: a humerus, a tibia, and a femur. Anthropologist Georges Vacher de la Pouge said that the femur alone showed that the person was at least 11 feet tall. Some people say that these bones could have belonged to a big animal from the past, but the forms were said to look like human bones. After being sent to the University of Montpellier, the bones were never seen again, which made rumors even stronger. The lack of preserved evidence remains the biggest obstacle. Many alleged giant skeletons were unearthed before strict archaeological standards were established, and photographic evidence from that era is often suspect or poorly documented. However, the sheer number of reports, scattered across continents and cultures, keeps the mystery alive. Why do so many ancient burial sites seem to hint at individuals who stood far above normal human height? There are still stories about the discovery of giant skeletons now and then. In 2012, a picture that went popular said it showed huge human bones that had been found in Greece, but it turned out to be a Photoshop fake. But real archaeologists in Ecuador, Sardinia, and Peru keep finding bones that are too big for animals that are no longer alive. Most of the time, these bones belong to extinct megafauna, like mastodons or huge sloths. Megalithic architecture that shouldn't be possible. When you stand in front of the old stones of Baalbek in Lebanon, one thing is clear: these blocks were not made for regular people to move. The Stone of the Pregnant Woman, a single megalith that is partly buried in the quarry, is thought to weigh 1,000 tons. Nearby, stones that were even bigger, up to 1,650 tons, were cut and placed with amazing accuracy. Cranes today have a hard time lifting things that big, but ancient builders not only carved these blocks, but also put them exactly where they needed to go to build huge building foundations. Who or what was strong enough to do this a long time ago? Mainstream archaeology explains Baalbek's construction through a mix of ingenuity, manpower, and possibly wooden rollers or levers. But even if that's true, the scale of the task pushes the limits of what we know about ancient engineering. Some alternative researchers argue that the size of these stones suggests something else entirely: a workforce of people far stronger and larger than us. Local legends even speak of ancient giant kings who laid the first stones long before the Romans built their own temples on top of the site. Baalbek isn't the only mystery. Across the world, colossal stone structures appear where they shouldn't. At Sacsayhuaman in Peru, interlocking stones weighing over 100 tons fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, so tightly that not even a sheet of paper can slip between them. The Inca credited their gods for these works. But what if the gods were simply larger-than-life ancestors whose strength made such construction possible? Then there's the puzzling Pumapunku ruins in Bolivia, where finely carved andesite blocks, some weighing 80 tons, are arranged in patterns so precise they appear machine-cut. Legends among the local Aymara people describe bearded giants helping to build these structures. Skeptics argue that the giants were just mythological symbols of strength, but the oral traditions consistently emphasize their physical size and power. To make things even stranger, the Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey is thought to be the world's oldest known mosque, dating back 11,000 years. Each of the huge T-shaped pillars, which weighs between 10 and 20 tons, was cut out of the rock and moved by ancient hunters and gatherers who didn't have metal tools or wheels. Could small groups of hunters and gatherers have done this on their own, or did someone incredibly strong help them? In Japan's Yonaguni Monument, a mysterious underwater stone structure, some researchers have speculated about ancient construction before rising seas swallowed it. Massive staircases and terraces appear carved into the rock, prompting comparisons to megalithic builders elsewhere. What ties all these sites together is their shared defiance of logic. The engineering is advanced, the stones gigantic, and the effort almost unimaginable. While mainstream archaeology insists humans achieved these feats through innovation and sheer determination, the size of the stones keeps fueling alternative theories. Were these megaliths designed for normal humans, or for something much bigger? Of course, thinking that giants built them isn't the only way to explain them. It's possible that these cultures came up with methods that we don't fully understand yet. Some lost ways of relaxing stone or levitating heavy things with sound are mentioned in ancient texts. But the question still stands: why do so many stories about ancient builders always talk about tall, godlike people working on these structures? The Goliath skull claims, examining oversized skulls. The so-called giant skulls that have been found all over the world are one of the most controversial bits of supposed evidence. Oversized skulls, often distorted or elongated, have been found in graveyards from South America to Asia. Many of these have been written off as natural changes or changes made during rituals, but some are still very strange. In Paracas, Peru, long heads from more than 3,000 years ago were found in old tombs. This is one of the most famous examples. The Paracas people practiced cranial deformation by tying babies' heads together, which is how their famous cone-shaped skulls came to be. But some of these skulls look not only longer, but also much bigger and thicker than normal human skulls, with cranial volumes that are up to 25% higher than usual. Some people think this is just normal variation, but others say these people might be part of a separate genetic group that is related to Andean stories about tall, red-haired beings. In Mexico's Sonora Valley, archaeologists unearthed unusually large skulls in 2012, sparking wild claims of alien ancestry. Though later identified as deformed through cultural head-binding practices, the sheer size of some specimens raised eyebrows. Similarly, in Malta's Hypogeum of Halsaflieni, early excavations reportedly uncovered skulls with abnormally elongated crania, some described as having simian or non-human features. The skulls allegedly vanished after being turned over to museum authorities, fueling conspiracy theories. Asia, too, has its share of giant skull mysteries. In China's Harbin region, the recently studied Dragon Man skull, though belonging to an archaic human species, shows massive cranial dimensions compared to modern humans, reigniting debates about whether ancient populations included unusually large individuals. Perhaps the most sensational claim involves the so-called Goliath skull references, named after the biblical giant. In the late 1800s, explorers in the Middle East reported skulls far larger than any known human specimens, some allegedly belonging to skeletons over 10 feet tall. These claims were poorly documented and largely dismissed, but they continue to appear in fringe archaeological literature. Mainstream science attributes most of these anomalies to known conditions like gigantism, acromegaly, or cultural cranial shaping. But proponents of the giant theory argue that the sheer global distribution of oversized skull reports is suspicious. Why did so many ancient cultures feel compelled to reshape their skulls to appear larger and taller? Was it simply aesthetic, or an attempt to mimic real, physically imposing ancestors? Some experts have tried genetic testing on skulls that are too big, but the results have been mixed. A study done in 2018 on the Paraxas skulls found unusual maternal haplogroups that aren't common in local Andean populations. This led to rumors about an unknown genetic lineage. But some critics say that the samples were tainted or the results were wrong. Whether through natural evolution, rare genetic conditions, or misidentifications, these oversized skulls continue to stoke curiosity. They may not conclusively prove giants once roamed the earth, but they provide a tantalizing link between legend and physical evidence. Hints of a past where humans may not have been the only dominant species walking upright. Giants in ancient Sumerian texts. Before the Bible talked about the Nephilim, the Sumerians, who lived in the earliest known society, wrote about huge beings that changed the course of history. These stories are written on clay tablets that are more than 5,000 years old. They are some of the first written accounts of beings that look like giants. The most famous are the Anunnaki, a pantheon of gods described as descending from the heavens to rule over humanity. While mainstream historians interpret the Anunnaki as symbolic deities, certain translations describe them as physically imposing, sometimes referred to as great ones, or those of enormous stature. Some tablets even portray these beings as having the ability to interbreed with humans, resulting in offspring who were stronger, larger, and considered semi-divine. The Epic of Gilgamesh further supports the giant narrative. Gilgamesh himself, king of Uruk, was described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, standing so tall and strong that no ordinary man could rival him. The text emphasizes his superhuman size, comparing him to mountains, and describing his strides as covering vast distances. While poetic exaggeration is a possibility, it's intriguing that multiple Mesopotamian rulers were depicted as physically colossal, suggesting a cultural memory of unusually large individuals. The story of Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu has another interesting connection. Enkidu was a huge, hairy, wild man who lived with animals before he became civilized. He was so strong that he could wrestle cats and bend metal with his hands. Some experts think that Enkidu is a story from the past, about a race of big, primitive humans who lived with the first people who lived in cities. Sumerian king lists include rulers with lifespans lasting hundreds or even thousands of years. Some fringe theorists argue that these extreme lifespans were attributed to a race of beings physically superior to normal humans, possibly giants who lived long before recorded history transitioned to more normal human reigns. Artifacts from Sumerian cities also depict humanoid figures far larger than surrounding humans. Cylinder seals and reliefs sometimes show towering figures standing over kneeling men, their proportions noticeably exaggerated. Critics claim these size differences are artistic conventions meant to represent power, not physical reality. But if that were the case, why do oral traditions and written texts repeatedly describe these figures as literally large, not just metaphorically mighty? Later, Akkadian and Babylonian texts carried on similar stories, preserving legends of giant warriors and demigods. The Sumerian influence stretched far beyond Mesopotamia, possibly inspiring later Hebrew and biblical accounts of giant races, including the Nephilim. Some researchers even suggest the stories traveled through trade routes, evolving as they were retold across cultures. Some doubters say that the giants in Sumerian myth were never meant to be taken literally. Instead, they say that they were higher than human kings, heroes, or gods, but the way they were described, as being very big, very strong, and having mixed-race ancestry, sounds a lot like giant stories from very different parts of the world. This makes it more likely that the stories came from real encounters with very big humans, or an unknown species of hominin. Biblical Nephilim and their alleged descendants. The Hebrew Bible talks about the Nephilim, who are one of the most famous stories about giants in history. Their stories have led people to speculate for hundreds of years. In Genesis 6:4, it says that they are the children of the sons of God and the daughters of men. It calls them a strange hybrid race of mighty men of old, men of fame. Different interpretations exist, but many old Jewish writings show the Nephilim as being very big, sometimes towering over normal people like predators over prey. The Bible's account implies that the Nephilim were present both before and after the Great Flood, hinting at two separate generations. Before the flood, they were said to fill the earth with violence and corruption, which some interpret as one of the reasons God decided to cleanse the world. After the flood, scattered references suggest that remnants of these giant lineages survived in isolated regions. The Book of Numbers, 1333, offers a direct glimpse into these later giants. When Israelite spies scouted the land of Canaan, they reported seeing descendants of Anak described as giants, adding, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The Anakim, Rephaim, and other giant tribes, such as the Emim and Zamzumim, are repeatedly mentioned as fierce, towering warriors inhabiting the ancient Near East. The most famous giant descendant, of course, is Goliath of Gath, the Philistine warrior defeated by David. Though modern translations vary, early manuscripts describe Goliath as standing 6 cubits and a span, roughly 9 feet 9 inches tall. Some argue this measurement was exaggerated or mistranslated, but even conservative estimates place him far above average human height for the time. Archaeological evidence, though scarce, occasionally aligns with these stories. Ancient Canaanite ruins have yielded large weapons, swords and spears far heavier than typical Bronze Age armaments, suggesting they may have been ceremonial or designed for larger than average warriors. Skeptics dismiss these as ritual objects, but their practicality in battle remains debated. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text excluded from the Bible, but still influential in early theology, expands on the Nephilim myth. It claims the Watchers, a group of fallen angels, descended to earth and took human wives, producing hybrid offspring, giants who devoured crops, animals, and eventually humans. These hybrids were said to grow so large and violent that they turned on humanity, forcing divine intervention. Though not canonical, this story mirrors flood myths from Mesopotamia and even South America, where giant hybrid beings are also blamed for chaos. According to some experts, the stories about the Nephilim may have come from meetings with human groups that were unusually tall or genetic outliers who were giants. Others think they are skewed memories of a species of human that has since gone extinct that have been passed down orally. No matter where these stories came from, the fact that they have been told for thousands of years and are repeated by cultures all over the world says that they were based on something memorable. Certain Christian and Jewish traditions claim that some Nephilim bloodlines survived well into historic times. Medieval Jewish writings, for example, link the Philistine giants directly to the ancient Anakim. Early European chroniclers even speculated that the Norse frost giants, or Irish Fomorians, might share distant roots with biblical giant myths. The lost city of giants in Ecuador. The people who live in Ecuador call this place the Ciudad de los Gigantes, which means City of Giants. Hidden in a thick jungle and shrouded in mystery, this site has gained attention for one reason. Huge stone tools and megalithic ruins that are too big for regular people to have used them have been found there. The legend of the City of Giants begins with indigenous Shuar and Aqua oral traditions. For generations, these tribes have spoken of colossal beings who once lived in the region, describing them as powerful, but not necessarily hostile. According to these legends, the giants eventually disappeared, leaving behind massive stone structures and tools as silent evidence of their existence. The first modern reports of this mysterious site surfaced in 2012, when explorers and local guides uncovered unusually large flat stone walls deep within the jungle. Some of the stones measured several meters across and were cut with an accuracy that baffled experts, appearing almost like giant building blocks. Unlike typical Amazonian structures, which were made from wood or clay, these megaliths suggested a far more advanced and physically powerful builder. The huge tools that were found nearby were even more impressive. It is said that one stone hammer weighed over 70 pounds and had a grip that was too thick for a regular person's hand. Other objects, like axes and chisels, looked way too heavy to be useful for a normal person. This led to the idea that they were made for beings that were very strong and big. The team investigating the site, which included archaeologists and geologists, debated whether the ruins were natural formations or remnants of an ancient civilization. Some experts suggested the stones might be volcanic rock fractures mistaken for man-made walls. However, the straight angles and deliberate stacking patterns contradicted this theory, leading others to argue for human, or possibly giant, intervention. There are reports of fossilized giant footprints in the nearby Amazon, some of which are over 40 centimeters long. This adds to the riddle. Local tribes say these prints were made by the same beings who built the City of Giants, even though erosion and natural rock forms can make them look different. The region's legends also align with similar stories across South America. The Inca and other Andean cultures spoke of ancient massive beings who once roamed the continent, sometimes helping humans construct great cities before vanishing. Ecuador's ruins, if proven authentic, could be one of the strongest archaeological links to these stories. Sadly, there is still not a lot of scientific study available at the site. Formal excavation has been slowed down by the dense jungle, political limits, and doubts from other archaeologists. Some experts think the walls and tools may be from thousands of years ago, even before known Amazonian cultures. Others say the whole site is just a bunch of misunderstood geology and myth made more interesting by sensationalism. Sardinia's Giants of Monte Prama. The Giants of Monte Prama are one of the most interesting hints that archaeologists have found in their search for ancient giants. They were found on the island of Sardinia in Italy. In the 1970s, these mysterious stone statues were found in pieces near Cabras. They show tall fighters, archers, and boxers, with some standing over 2.5 meters, 8 feet, tall. But researchers are interested in more than just their size. They are interested in what they reflect. The statues are attributed to the Nuragic civilization, which flourished in Sardinia between 1800 BCE and 500 BCE. The Nuragic people are already famous for their megalithic stone towers called nuragis, some of which weigh dozens of tons and remain an engineering mystery. But the Monte Prama statues suggest they also revered, or recorded, figures much larger than ordinary humans. Unlike typical statues of the time, which portrayed people at life-size or slightly idealized proportions, the Monte Prama figures are massive, with exaggerated musculature, broad shoulders, and disproportionately large heads. Some researchers argue these were simply artistic exaggerations meant to glorify warriors, much like Greek heroic sculptures. However, others point out that the statue's proportions seem carefully modeled on real physical traits, suggesting they may depict actual individuals, possibly taller and more imposing than the average neuralgic person. What adds to the mystery is the discovery of unusually large tombs near the site. Excavations revealed burial chambers longer and wider than typical neuralgic graves, leading to speculation that they may have housed individuals of exceptional size or status. Though no complete giant skeletons were found, the combination of oversized tombs and colossal warrior statues has fueled local legends. In Sardinian folklore, tales of the giganti, giants who once roamed the island, are deeply ingrained. Stories describe them as ancient protectors and builders who constructed the nuragas and other massive stone monuments before disappearing. Even today, some locals claim their ancestors passed down stories of skeletal remains so large they were mistaken for ogres or titans. Adding to this are reports from early European travelers who wrote about unusually tall skeletons unearthed in Sardinian burial mounds during the 19th century. While no verified remains exist today, these accounts mirror similar reports of giant bones across the Mediterranean. Mainstream archaeology, of course, rejects the idea of real giants, arguing that the statues simply glorify heroic warriors or represent deities. The oversized graves, they say, may have been for prominent chiefs rather than unusually large individuals. Yet, the consistency between folklore, monumental architecture, and the statue's imposing size keeps alternative theories alive. The statues at Monte Prama are also interesting because they have military features on them. They are holding carefully carved, realistic weapons like big shields, spears, and bows, which suggests that these weren't magical creatures but real fighters who made people afraid and respect them. If these were based on real fighters, were they maybe bigger and stronger than most people, making them stand out so much that they became legendary? The statues have been carefully fixed up and are now on show in museums in Sardinia, but the questions still remain. Did they paint giant versions of neuralgic fighters, or were they based on real people who were much stronger than the rest of their people? Oversized weapons found in ancient burial sites. Through history, guns have often shown how big and strong the person using them was. But archaeologists have found guns in several old graveyards that are so big and heavy that it doesn't seem like a normal person could use them. Were these ceremonial items meant to impress? Or were they proof of fighters much bigger than we think? Bashkortostan, Russia, is where experts say they found swords over 1.8 meters, 6 feet long, in early Iron Age burial mounds. This is one of the most strange finds. Some ancient cultures did make long swords for ceremonies, but the way they were balanced and weighed showed that they were used. To swing such a weapon well in battle, a fighter would have to be very strong and maybe even very tall. Similar finds have surfaced in Japan's Kofun burial mounds, where massive iron swords, including the Nihon's longest sword at 2.3 meters, were buried with elite warriors. Historians often argue these oversized blades symbolized power rather than being used in combat. But even ceremonial weapons were usually designed within reasonable limits. Why forge something that would be impossible for its owner to even lift, unless such size wasn't unusual for them? In Northern Europe, Viking burial sites have occasionally produced massive battle axes with handles much thicker and heavier than standard Viking weaponry. Some scholars suggest these were wielded by elite berserkers renowned for their brute strength. Others propose they might have been crafted for men who were significantly taller and stronger than the average Norse warrior, whose height averaged around 5 feet 7 inches. South America adds to the enigma. Researchers have found huge stone clubs and maces in the mountains of Peru and Bolivia that are too big for humans to use. In local legends, giant warriors were overthrown by normal-sized humans. The giants were often presented as cruel rulers. These myths seem to fit strangely with the huge weapons that have been found at old ceremonial sites. Even more perplexing is the fact that many of these huge weapons are found buried next to graves that are extremely big. Some of the Monte Prama tombs in Sardinia had huge stone shields that were cut to fit the statues inside them. This is another sign that these weapons were meant to represent real, powerful people instead of made-up gods. Skeptics argue that most oversized weapons were purely ceremonial, intended to display wealth, power, or religious devotion. It's true that many ancient cultures built exaggerated objects for ritual purposes. However, not all of these weapons are impractical or blunt. Some show clear signs of wear, nicks, sharpening marks, and stress fractures, indicating they were used in real combat. If these weapons really did come from giant fighters, were they from separate tribes or mixed-race families like those talked about in the Bible and Mesopotamian texts? Or maybe they are elite warriors who were carefully bred or genetically gifted with unusually high and strong heights, like some people who are gigantic today. Peru's giant legends and elongated skulls. There are many interesting ancient mysteries in Peru, but the giant stories and the finding of strange skulls that are very long are two of the most interesting. Myths and real-world evidence have come together to make one of the strongest cases for the presence of giant-like beings in South America. The earliest written accounts of Peruvian giants come from Spanish chroniclers during the 16th century. Conquistadors like Pedro Cieza de León recorded native stories describing enormous people who arrived by sea long before the Incas. According to local legends, these giants were so large they could barely fit into traditional houses and had to live in open spaces or build their own massive dwellings. Some stories claim they were cannibalistic and hostile, eventually wiped out by natural disasters or divine punishment. But legends alone aren't what make Peru so intriguing. The real fascination lies in the Paracas skulls. Discovered in the 1920s by Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello, these skulls, dating back around 3,000 years, are not only elongated but significantly larger and heavier than normal human skulls. While cranial deformation, binding infant skulls to achieve a conical shape, was common in ancient Peru, some of these skulls show increased cranial volume, thicker bone structure, and unusual suture patterns, inconsistent with typical head binding. Supporters of the giant theory argue that these features could point to a different genetic lineage, possibly a race of naturally large-bodied humans who later influenced Andean culture. In fact, local oral traditions often describe the Paracas people as tall and red-haired, an unusual trait for native South Americans. Further inland, in Cusco and Tiwanaku, similar elongated skulls have been unearthed in burial sites, some alongside massive stone blocks that form walls too large for small human communities to have moved without advanced engineering. This combination of oversized architecture and unusual human remains adds weight to the theory that an advanced, possibly larger population once thrived in the Andes. Genetic testing is one of the most convincing pieces of proof we have today. In 2018, scientists looked at DNA samples from a number of Paracas bodies and found haplogroups that aren't usually found in native South American groups. Some people say that these results might be related to ancient migration patterns instead of a completely different species, but the strange finding has kept alternative scholars interested. Reports say that huge bones were found in northern Peru, which adds to the riddle. Farmers have sometimes said they found femurs and jaw bones that are too big, but most of the time, these claims go away before they can be confirmed by researchers. Skeptics say they are the wrongly identified remains of extinct megafauna like giant ground sloths, but local tales say they are the remains of giant humans from a long time ago. The Nazca region also holds clues. The enormous Nazca lines, visible only from the air, depict massive humanoid figures, some with exaggerated limbs and heads. While these geoglyphs are often interpreted as symbolic, their giant proportions have fueled speculation that they might represent real beings who once roamed the region. Andean farmers still tell stories about Los Gigantes. They say that these beings were ancient builders who built huge stone walls and roads and then disappeared without a trace. These stories are told very similarly in many places in Peru, which suggests they may be based on real events or long-forgotten memories from the past. Ancient petroglyphs depicting giant humans. Rock art from long ago tells stories about the past all over the world. Some of these stories seem to hint at something strange: giant people walking among normal-sized people. Petroglyphs, which are drawings on stone walls and canyon walls, are one of the oldest ways that history has been written. They often show figures that are not only metaphorically bigger than life, but also physically taller than their human companions, in ways that don't follow normal artistic conventions. In the American Southwest, particularly in Utah's Sego Canyon and Nevada's Lovelock Cave region, ancient Native American tribes left behind striking images of humanoid figures with elongated limbs and towering proportions. Some of these figures stand several times taller than the smaller human-like carvings beside them. Local Paiute legends tell of the Sitaka, a race of red-haired giants who once inhabited the region and fought against native tribes before being wiped out. The rock art, according to tribal elders, is not symbolic. It is historical, meant to record real encounters with these towering enemies. In Australia, Aboriginal rock art also depicts unusually tall human-like beings. Known as the Wandjina, these figures have disproportionately large heads and are often shown looming over normal humans. Aboriginal oral traditions describe them as sky beings who descended to teach humans, but some researchers interpret them as memories of a physically imposing race rather than extraterrestrial visitors. Moving to Africa, the Sahara Desert holds some of the most compelling giant depictions. The Tassili-Inaja rock art in Algeria shows massive humanoid figures interacting with smaller humans and animals. One famous carving, dubbed the Great Martian God, depicts a towering figure with outstretched arms dominating the scene. Though mainstream archaeologists view these as spiritual or symbolic representations, others argue they may reflect encounters with extraordinarily tall humans who once lived in the region before the desertification of the Sahara. South America also contributes to this strange narrative. In Brazil's Inga stone and the petroglyphs of Venezuela, humanoid figures with extremely long limbs and large, elongated heads stand among regular-sized humans. Andean myths often describe ancient builders who were giant-sized and came before the Inca, which some believe could explain these artistic choices. Interestingly, these depictions are often consistent in proportion, with giants portrayed as roughly twice or even 3 times the height of normal humans. If this was purely symbolic, why do so many unrelated cultures, separated by continents and thousands of years, choose to show their gods or ancestors as gigantic in almost identical ratios? Some people doubt that ancient artists blew up the sizes of important figures to show power or divinity. This was popular in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they say. For example, pharaohs were often drawn bigger than their slaves to show power, not size. But in many of these petroglyphs, the giants are not shown as kings or masters. Instead, they are shown hunting, walking among people, or even fighting, which suggests they were natural beings rather than gods. Some experts have said that these huge pictures are often found in places where strange bones or tools that are too big for their bodies have been found, like in Nevada's Lovelock Cave or Sardinia's Monte Prama. This makes it more likely that the art wasn't just made-up stories, but a real record of what people saw in the past. Petroglyphs are among humanity's oldest historical records, created by cultures that carved what they saw and experienced into stone. If these figures were only metaphors, why would such detailed, consistent depictions of towering humans appear in so many different parts of the world? Could these carvings be the world's earliest photographs of real giants who once walked the earth? The grave of the kings in India. India has a lot of myths and stories about the past. For hundreds of years, people have told stories about giants. One of the most interesting places connected to these stories is Karnataka, where people talk about a strange place called the Grave of the Kings. Even though that name isn't used officially in archaeological records, it refers to ancient burial grounds where allegedly very large skeletal remains were found during early excavations. According to local folklore, these burial sites belong to a race of Rakshasas, giant warriors, and fierce beings mentioned in the Ramayana and other Hindu epics. Described as towering, muscular, and immensely strong, the Rakshasas were believed to have lived among humans thousands of years ago, sometimes waging wars against them. While Hindu mythology often depicts them as demonic, some traditions describe them more as a giant warrior-like tribe, rather than purely supernatural creatures. In the early 19th and 20th centuries, British colonial officers and amateur archaeologists documented unusual finds in the region. Reports surfaced of skeletal remains measuring over 7 to 9 feet in length, with femurs thicker than any average human bone. These records, though sparse and lacking modern verification, were noted in private journals and letters sent back to England. Many of these skeletons allegedly disappeared after being sent to museums or private collectors, fueling speculation that they were intentionally hidden or misclassified. The burial mounds themselves were massive compared to typical human graves, some stretching several meters in length. Local villagers claimed they had always been told these mounds contained the bones of ancient warrior kings who were as tall as 2 men. In some areas, stone sarcophagi and urns, far larger than normal human proportions, have been uncovered, further adding to the mystery. What makes the Karnataka legends compelling is how closely they align with ancient Sanskrit texts. The Mahabharata, for instance, describes the Bhima and other Pandava brothers as towering superhuman warriors, capable of extraordinary feats of strength. Bhima himself is often described as so tall and strong that he could wield a mace too heavy for ordinary humans. Some scholars argue that these descriptions may have been inspired by real individuals suffering from gigantism, or by memories of an ancient, physically imposing population. Similar giant-related discoveries have been reported in other parts of India. In Narmada Valley, oversized human-like bones were occasionally discovered. Some speculated to belong to archaic hominins, but often attributed in folklore to ancient tall kings. In Bihar, megalithic burial sites have been found with unusually large stone slabs covering the graves, suggesting they were designed for larger bodies or to honor individuals of great stature. Most mainstream historians don't believe these claims about giant skeletons because they think the people making them are exaggerating, misidentifying animal bones, or using sensationalism from the colonial era. But the secret lives on because local stories about the tombs are always the same, and the tombs are very big. Could these grave of the king's sites be the remains of a real group of humans who were very tall? The stories of these people became the basis for Indian epics about giant warriors. Or are they just myths mixed with natural oddities every once in a while, like rare cases of gigantism? The Lovelock Cave Giants. Lovelock Cave in Nevada is the site of one of the most famous and controversial giant stories in North America. For more than 100 years, historians, scientists, and conspiracy theorists have all been interested in this empty cave. The Paiute tribe says that this cave was once the last refuge of the Siteka, a race of giants with red hair that ate people. The Paiute oral tradition describes the Siteka as towering, aggressive beings who terrorized local tribes, raiding villages and devouring captured humans. Eventually, the tribes united to defeat them, driving the giants into Lovelock Cave. Once trapped inside, the Paiute piled brush at the cave's entrance and set it ablaze, killing the remaining giants. To the Paiute, this was not myth. It was history, passed down through generations. The legend gained new life in 1911, when guano miners digging in Lovelock Cave stumbled upon thousands of artifacts, including weapons, baskets, and bones. Among the finds were oversized sandals, some measuring over 15 inches long, and skeletal remains that some claimed belonged to people well over 7 feet tall. Several skulls were described as having unusual features: broad jaws, thick brow ridges, and red hair still clinging to some of the remains. In 1912, archaeologists from the University of California conducted official excavations, recovering over 10,000 artifacts. But the giant claims quickly became disputed. While some early reports by workers and locals insisted the bones were enormous, the university's official findings later categorized most remains as belonging to average-sized humans. Critics argue that the largest bones were either ignored or quietly removed to prevent sensationalist claims, though no conclusive evidence supports this accusation. But the giant sandals are still the most convincing piece of proof. They are made from knitted plant fibers, and their size makes me think they were either made for people with very big feet or were purposely made bigger for a ceremony. But why would an old culture make shoes that aren't useful if it wasn't based on reality? Photographs from the early 20th century show workers holding large skulls allegedly found in the cave. Some accounts describe these skulls as having double rows of teeth, a recurring claim in giant legends worldwide. Though none of these skulls are verifiable today, most were either lost or stored in private collections. The descriptions closely match other reports of alleged giant remains across North America. Skeptics say that the Sitekar were just stories, possibly based on real-life meetings with very tall people or rival tribes. They say that the red hair might just be dark hair that turned red over time because of minerals that formed in the cave. They also say that despite many digs, no complete giant skeletons have ever been found in Lovelock Cave. Paiute people are still sure that the Sitekar were real. Elders in the tribe keep telling the same story that their ancestors did, about humans who refused to be giants' food and drove them to extinction. And the strange artifacts, especially the sandals that are too big for the feet, are still there to tell us of something amazing that happened in the cave's past. Lovelock Cave is a fascinating amalgam of myth and archaeology. It has strange artifacts and old stories that keep the discussion going. Were the Sitekar real? They were a group of humans who were unusually tall and left physical proof. Or are the objects just misunderstood relics from normal-sized people whose stories got taller over time, like the giants? Polynesian legends of colossal ancestors. Polynesia is made up of many small islands. There are stories that giant ancestors ruled the land and built the huge buildings you see today. Oral histories from Tonga to Easter Island talk about huge beings that were very strong, made huge stone structures, and sometimes hung out with humans before disappearing for no reason. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, is where one of the most well-known stories comes from. The famous Moai figures on the island, some of which weigh over 80 tons, are often linked to long-ear ancestors, a group of people who are said to be taller and stronger than normal humans. When Europeans first came to the island, some people said that their ancestors were so tall that they could carry the Moai statues standing with just ropes. Archaeologists think the figures were moved by a group of people working together and using wooden sleds. But the locals always say that these huge feats were done by a race that was physically stronger than the Rapa Nui today. In Tonga, legends of giants are tied to the construction of Haamunga, a Maui, a massive stone trilithon built from coral limestone slabs weighing around 40 tons each. Local lore claims it was erected by Maui, a legendary demigod often described as a giant in Polynesian myth. Some versions of the story even suggest Maui carried the stones on his shoulders across great distances. While considered mythical, the sheer size of the trilithon keeps the story alive, as its construction techniques remain partly unexplained. In Hawaii, oral traditions tell of Kana, a giant who could stretch his body across islands. Though clearly mythologized, some Hawaiian chiefs were noted by early explorers to be exceptionally tall and robust compared to average islanders, possibly giving rise to tales of giant ancestors. The Marquesas Islands also preserve intriguing legends. The first inhabitants, according to oral history, were a race of tall, light-skinned people known as the Tupua, who built stone platforms and massive terraces still visible today. Early European explorers in the 18th century documented finding unusually large burial sites in these islands, though no conclusive skeletal evidence has survived. Some archaeologists say that Polynesians were very good at building and navigating, and that they were able to move and set up huge stones without using brute force. However, some ancient burial chambers, especially in Tonga and Samoa, are much bigger than normal Polynesian graves. This has led to the idea that they may have been made for people who were very big or important. In Polynesian myths, giant ancestors are often described as teachers or rulers, which suggests that they were not gods but real people who dealt with humans. Many oral tales say that these giants married regular people. Some see these stories as symbolic stories of powerful chief lineages, while others see them as long-lost memories of a real group of people who were very tall. Polynesians crossed the Pacific Ocean thousands of miles, and genetic tests show that sometimes they mixed with people from South America. Because of this, some people think that the stories of giants in Polynesia may have come from Andean stories about tall, red-haired people. These stories may have been shared through old contact, long before Europeans came. It's amazing how similar these stories are across the vast Pacific, whether they are myths or true stories. Polynesia still has stone monuments and burial grounds that are too big to be explained by easy explanations. Stories of giant ancestors are more than just stories told around the campfire. They are part of the culture of whole island nations. The megalith builders of Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is the world's oldest known temple complex and one of archaeology's biggest secrets. It is tucked away in the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey. This site was made by hunter-gatherers about 11,000 years ago, which is a long time before farming or cities were meant to exist. Even more interesting is the fact that the megaliths are so big, which suggests that people who were physically bigger may have helped build them. Göbekli Tepe consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing between 10 to 20 tons, with the largest estimated at 50 tons. These pillars were arranged in circular enclosures and intricately carved with images of animals, abstract symbols, and even humanoid figures. What's baffling is that these were constructed thousands of years before the wheel, metal tools, or domesticated animals were available. How did early humans quarry, transport, and erect these colossal stones with such precision? Mainstream archaeology attributes Göbekli Tepe's construction to coordinated labor by hundreds of skilled workers using simple stone tools and ropes. But alternative researchers point out a glaring issue. The hunter-gatherer population at the time was small, and there is no evidence of permanent settlements nearby to support such a massive workforce. Could the builders themselves have been larger, stronger, and possibly a different branch of early humans with physical capabilities beyond ours? Carvings at Göbekli Tepe add fuel to this speculation. Some depict towering humanoid figures with disproportionately long arms and broad shoulders, standing alongside animals. While these might represent gods or symbolic protectors, the fact that they are carved in lifelike detail suggests they could have been based on real beings. One famous carving, dubbed the Urfa Man, found near the site, shows a human figure with unusually large hands and an elongated head, reminiscent of depictions of giants in other ancient cultures. Local Kurdish legends also speak of ancient giant builders, sometimes referred to as the first men, who constructed monumental stone circles before vanishing mysteriously. Although these stories are considered folklore, they align with similar traditions across the Middle East that describe an earlier race of physically imposing humans who laid the foundations of civilization. The scale of construction further hints at something unusual. Many of the pillars were not only quarried miles away, but also lifted into place without leaving obvious drag marks or ramps. Modern experimental archaeology has struggled to replicate these feats with small teams, even using advanced knowledge of leverage and counterweights. Were the builders simply using techniques we've lost, or did their physical strength reduce the need for elaborate engineering? Genetic studies of human remains from the area show that the people were not all the same height and bone structure-wise, compared to farmers who lived later in the Neolithic period. Some skeletons were noticeably taller and stronger than normal early Holocene humans. This suggests that there may have been a population that was physically better. DNA clues in unusual human remains. If giants really did exist, DNA testing would be one of the best ways to prove it. But in the past few years, studies on strange human remains have brought up more questions than answers. Most strange things in science are thought to be caused by natural variation or rare genetic disorders. However, some DNA results point to lineages that don't fit nicely into known human ancestry. The Paracas skulls in Peru are one of the most disputed facts in this area. As was already said, these long skulls are much bigger and thicker than normal human skulls. In 2018, a private group tested several of these bodies for mitochondrial DNA. The data showed that these haplogroups were more common among people from Europe and the Middle East than among native South Americans. Some other experts said this suggests a different genetic lineage, maybe a hybrid population that could explain the big skulls and stories of giant foreigners coming to South America. But some people didn't trust the sample methods and said they could be contaminated or misinterpreted. In Siberia, DNA from the 40,000-year-old Ust-Ishim femur revealed a robust hominin who, while not a giant, carried genetic traits now absent in modern humans. Some researchers speculate that similar lost lineages, possibly taller and stronger than average Homo sapiens, may have interbred with early human populations, creating rare outliers remembered in myths as giants. There are also peculiar findings from the Denisovans, an extinct human species known primarily from a few bones and teeth found in Denisova Cave. Their fossils show massive molars and robust bone structures, suggesting they were larger and more muscular than Homo sapiens. Genetic traces of Denisovans survive in some modern human populations, particularly in Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. Coincidentally, the same regions rich with giant legends, such as Australia's Wandjina beings or the Solomon Islands tales of red-haired giants. In North America, a few Native American burial sites with oversized bones have sparked interest in genetic testing, though most legitimate archaeological studies have concluded these skeletons were within normal human variation. However, reports from the early 20th century, many predating modern excavation standards, claimed some remains exceeded 7 to 9 feet in length. Unfortunately, many of these bones were either lost, mislabeled, or reburied before DNA analysis became possible. Geneticists have also studied rare cases of gigantism in modern humans, such as that caused by mutations in the AIP gene, which leads to excessive growth hormone production. Some speculate that ancient populations might have carried similar mutations, creating entire familial lines of unusually tall individuals. If these families intermarried within isolated communities, they could have produced groups of consistently large humans, possibly inspiring ancient giant legends. The most exciting thought is finding unidentified DNA, which is genetic material that doesn't belong to any known human species. A few fringe experts say they found these kinds of strange things in small tests, but no peer-reviewed study has proven this. If there is such proof, it could mean that they bred with a long-extinct hominin species or a huge group of extinct humans. The ancient Egyptian giant pharaoh mystery. Ancient Egypt is famous for its huge buildings and interest in divine kingship. There are also interesting hints of giant masters. Senakht, a king of Egypt's third dynasty, stands out among the pharaohs because he may have been the tallest ancient Egyptian ever found. In 2017, researchers from the University of Zurich studied his bones and found that he stood about 1.98 meters, 6 feet 6 inches, tall, which was very tall for his time, because the normal male height was about 1.67 meters, 5 feet 6 inches. What makes Senakht's case unusual is that his tall stature was not just above average, it bordered on gigantism, a rare condition caused by excess growth hormone. The bones in his skull and jaw suggested he may have had mild acromegaly, making him one of the earliest recorded cases of gigantism in history. While 6 feet 6 inches is far from the towering 9 to 12 foot giants of legend, Senakht's exceptional size for his era could explain why Egyptian texts often describe certain rulers as physically imposing even godlike. But Sarnacht isn't the only clue. Ancient Egyptian art frequently depicted gods and pharaohs as larger than ordinary humans, towering over servants and soldiers. Mainstream Egyptologists argue this was purely symbolic. Size represented power, not actual height. Yet occasional archaeological finds hint that some members of the royal elite may have been genuinely taller and more robust than average Egyptians, possibly due to selective breeding or genetic mutations. Legends of giant rulers also appear in later Egyptian folklore. Some ancient texts refer to the Shemsu Hor, or followers of Horus, a mysterious pre-dynastic race said to have ruled Egypt before the unification of the kingdom. These beings were described as semi-divine and of great size, often portrayed as towering over early humans. While mainstream historians interpret these stories as myth, some alternative researchers believe they could reflect a real, earlier population of unusually tall individuals. The megalithic architecture of ancient Egypt also feeds into giant-related speculation. Blocks weighing hundreds of tons were moved to build temples and pyramids, feats that still puzzle modern engineers. While there is no direct evidence that giants built these monuments, some theorists argue that legends of massive beings may have been inspired by exceptionally strong individuals who contributed to early construction techniques. There have been accounts of sarcophagi and burial chambers in places like Saqqara and the Serapeum of Memphis that are too big for their bodies. Some of the huge granite boxes weighed more than 70 tons. They were meant to hold holy Apis bulls, but some researchers think they may have been used for something else or were originally made for very large people. Even though no skeletons that are too big have been found in these sarcophagi, their sheer size continues to cause discussion. Even ancient Greek historians like Herodotus wrote of Egyptian priests telling stories about long-lost rulers of extraordinary size and strength who lived in pre-dynastic times. Whether these were exaggerations or preserved oral traditions of real individuals remains unknown. Giant footprints carved in stone. Huge footprints that have been preserved in stone are one of the most interesting pieces of proof that people think is from giants. Huge impressions that look like people have been found on several continents. Some are fossilized while others are carved. These have led to debates about whether they are the remains of real old giants or just symbolic works of art. One of the most well-known is in South Africa, where a huge footprint carved into rock is known as the footprint of God. The impression is over 1.2 meters, 4 feet long, and is so clear that you can see the toes and an arch. It looks like a giant stepped barefoot on soft ground that later turned into stone. Geologists say it might be a natural pattern of erosion, but giant hunters and curious tourists keep coming to see it because it looks so much like a foot. In Sri Lanka, the Sripada, or Adam's Peak, features another legendary giant footprint. This massive depression, around 1.8 meters, 6 feet in length, has been revered for centuries. Buddhists believe it to be the footprint of the Buddha, Hindus attribute it to Lord Shiva, and Christians and Muslims claim it belonged to Adam after being cast out of Eden. While clearly symbolic in religious context, its sheer size feeds into giant myths, with some claiming it's evidence of an ancient race of massive beings recorded in multiple faith traditions. Moving to China, the Guizhou province is home to enormous footprints carved into a cliff face, each several feet long. Local folklore says these belong to giant immortals who roamed the earth in prehistoric times. Similar legends surround the giant footsteps found in Thailand and Cambodia, where temple inscriptions describe godlike beings leaving their mark on the land. In North America, fossilized footprints in Glen Rose, Texas, caused a sensation when some appeared to show giant human tracks alongside dinosaur prints in the Paluxy riverbed. Early creationists touted them as proof that humans and dinosaurs coexisted, possibly hinting at a race of giant humans. However, most of these prints have since been dismissed as misidentified dinosaur tracks or hoaxes, though a few impressions still puzzle researchers due to their oddly human-like shape. South America also contributes to the mystery. In Paraguay and Peru, legends speak of giant ancestors who once strode across the mountains, leaving massive footprints behind. In some Andean villages, flat stone surfaces with giant foot-shaped depressions are still pointed out as proof of these ancient beings. Some deniers say that most of these tracks are just natural formations that were formed by erosion, volcanic activity, or people carving them for religious reasons. Indeed, it was clear that many of them were revered as holy places and not just written down. Still, the fact that footprint stories are common across cultures makes me wonder why so many ancient groups who lived on different sides of the oceans told the same stories about huge people leaving marks on the earth. In some cases, the footprints look like they were kept on purpose, with smooth carved edges that show they were made on purpose. If they were meant to be symbolic, they might have been based on memories of real people who were so big that early societies wanted to remember them forever by carving them in stone. Why so many cultures share giant myths? Giant stories can be found all over the world, from the icy cliffs of Scandinavia to the jungles of South America, and from the islands in the Pacific to the deserts of Africa. Different cultures, separated by seas and thousands of years, all have similar stories about huge people, demigods, or ancient races that lived among regular people, built huge structures, and then disappeared without a trace. Why do these stories have such a wide reach? One explanation points to shared ancestral memories. Before written history, oral traditions preserved major events for generations. If rare populations of exceptionally tall or robust humans existed, whether due to genetic traits, isolated evolution, or hybridization with archaic hominins, these encounters would have left a strong impression on early societies. Such individuals would have seemed godlike, their feats exaggerated over time until they became full-fledged legends. The way megaliths were built is another sign. At Baalbek, Stonehenge, Tiwanaku, and Easter Island, among other places, people in the past moved stones that weighed hundreds of tons. It was normal for regular people who saw these huge buildings, but didn't know how they were put together, to think that giant builders were responsible. In a lot of cultures, the words for giant and ancient builder mean the same thing. This suggests that these stories may have started as ways to explain impossible building feats. There's also a biological basis. Gigantism caused by genetic mutations exists even today. Rare cases like Robert Wadlow, 8 feet 11 inches tall, demonstrate that humans can grow to extraordinary heights. In ancient times, isolated populations with intermarrying families could have produced lineages of unusually tall individuals. Tribes encountering such groups might have remembered them as a distinct race, giants. Legends often carry consistent physical descriptions: great height, immense strength, unusual skull shapes, and even red or light-colored hair. These details appear in places as distant as Nevada's Paiute legends, Peru's Paracas skull myths, and Polynesian stories of giant ancestors. This level of consistency suggests either cultural contact or that people were describing something real. Psychological and symbolic interpretations can't be ignored. Giants often represent power, chaos, or divine authority. Ancient societies exaggerated the size of heroes, kings, or enemies to convey their strength. However, symbolism doesn't explain why specific details, like cannibalistic behavior, red hair, or massive tools, repeat worldwide, especially in regions with no historical contact. Archaeological anomalies add fuel to the mystery. Oversized weapons, elongated skulls, giant sandals, and enormous burial chambers often turn up near sites with giant legends. While mainstream explanations exist for each of these findings, the pattern is undeniable. Giant myths are almost always rooted in locations where something physically unusual has been discovered. Could ancient humans have shared a common memory of interbreeding with other hominin species? Fossil evidence of Denisovans and other archaic humans reveals that Homo sapiens once coexisted with different hominin populations. Some, like the Denisovans, were larger and stronger than modern humans. Their genetic traces survive in modern populations, particularly in regions where giant myths are strongest, such as Melanesia and Polynesia. It's possible that giants are just history blown up by time. After 100 years of stories, a 7-foot warrior might grow into a 9-foot legend. After 1,000 years, the tale might make him 12 feet tall. But even exaggeration needs a starting point, someone strange enough to make the first story interesting. Do you think these stories about giants were true? Or were they just myths? There are too many signs to ignore, like huge stone ruins, strange skulls, and stories told all over the world about ancient times. Leave your ideas in the comments if you think the evidence points to something bigger. Did you believe in giants? Or do you think they were just the heroes of made-up stories? Please share this movie with anyone who likes learning about old things that people have forgotten. We are digging up the past one puzzle at a time to find out what it holds.